I'm starting the cold open for this documentary piece, diving straight into the 1892 whaling ship encounter with immersive physical narration in a documentary voice, about 6,500 characters of flowing voiceover that sets the scene without any headers or conclusions. The sea was flat that morning, the kind of flat that whalers learn to distrust. A grey, unbroken skin stretched from the bow of the barque all the way to a horizon that gave nothing back. It was the 4th of September, 1892, somewhere south and west of the Falkland grounds, and the men of the whaling barque had been chasing a pod of sperm whales since first light. They had one already dead alongside, lashed to the starboard hull, half flensed, the water around it dark with oil and blood. And it was the blood, they would say afterward, that brought the shadow up. The first man to see it was standing at the rail with a flensing spade in his hands, looking down into the red water at the carcass they were cutting, and he said the light changed. Not the sky, the water, as if a cloud had passed beneath the ship instead of above it. He called out, and the men came to the rail, and they looked down, and for a long moment none of them understood what they were looking at, because the mind refuses a scale it has never been given. What they took at first for the sea floor rising was not the sea floor. The water there was 300 fathoms deep. What they were watching rise was an animal. It came up slowly, without hurry, the way a thing rises when nothing in the ocean has ever taught it to be afraid. First the shape of it resolved out of the dark, a long, pale mass broadening as it climbed, and then the edges of it found the light, and they could see it was ridged, plated, the flanks of it running in long, overlapping segments like the underside of some vast, armoured thing, each plate the grey-white of old bone. The men who wrote of it later, and there were more than one, kept reaching for the same words. Like a ship's hull, turned living. Like a whale that had been made wrong, made longer and harder and older than a whale has any right to be. It slid beneath the barque, and it did not end. The ship was a little over 100 feet at the waterline. The animal passed under her bow, and its head was already clear of the stern before the tail came into view, and the tail, one man swore, was still down in the dark, unseen. Then the head turned. It turned the way a door swings, deliberate and unbothered, and the side of the skull came up toward the surface, and that is when they saw the eye. They had all of them killed whales. They knew the eye of a sperm whale, small and dark and set low in that great blunt head, an eye that seems almost apologetic for the size of the animal behind it. This was not that. This eye was set high and forward, and it was round, and it was the size of a porthole, a full pale disk with a slot of black at its centre, and it came up out of the water enough that the men could see themselves reflected in the wet of it. And it was looking at them, not past them, not through them, at them. A survivor of that voyage, an old man by the time anyone thought to ask, said the thing that stayed with him was not the size and not the teeth. It was that the eye moved along the rail, man to man, counting them. The jaws they saw only when it rolled, and it rolled slow, showing them the long line of the mouth, and along that line the teeth stood up in a ragged white palisade, not the neat pegs of a sperm whale, but teeth of uneven lengths, some curved back like hooks, the largest of them, they guessed, longer than a man's forearm. The mouth, when it opened wide enough that the men understood in a single cold instant what they were seeing, because the dead sperm whale lashed to their hull was a large bull, 40 tons of animal, and the jaws that had just yawned open in the water beside it could have closed over that whale's flank the way a dog takes a rabbit's haunch. Could have, and by the look of the carcass, something very like it once had, because the beast was scarred. That was the detail the harpooner returned to again and again, the detail that turns the story from a sailor's tall tale into something colder. All down the pale flanks of it ran wounds, old healed wounds, long parallel furrows raked into the plating and grown over grey. And the men who studied whales for a living knew those marks. They had seen them on the great bulls they hunted, the deep gouges left when a sperm whale locks jaws with a giant squid, 1,000 fathoms down, and comes back up scarred by the beaks and the arms. Those were the marks of a whale's mouth, only these were on the outside of the monster. These were the marks left by whales that had tried and failed to get away from it. The scars of the hunted written onto the hide of the hunter. Nobody gave an order. Nobody reached for a harpoon. The man with the flensing spade said later that not one soul aboard so much as breathed loud, because every instinct that a hunting man has ever owned had reversed itself in the space of a minute, and they understood, all of them at once and without speaking, that they were no longer the thing that did the killing. The barque sat dead in the water, and the animal lay alongside her, longer than she was, and it regarded them with that pale, enormous eye, and the sea stayed flat, and the blood of the whale they had killed spread out around both of them, hunter and hunted, ship and shadow, in a widening dark stain. And then it took the carcass, not with violence. That is the part that still puts a cold hand on the back of my neck when I read the account, the almost gentle economy of it. The jaws came across, the water heaved once, and the 40-ton whale lashed to the hull was simply gone, ropes parted, the ship rocking back on her keel, and where a dead bull sperm whale had floated, there was nothing but rope ends and a slick of oil. The men felt the pull of it through the whole timber of the ship, and the shadow sank back down the way it had come, unhurried, plate by plate returning to the dark, the great eye the last of it to go, watching the rail until the water closed grey and flat over the top of it. They logged their position, they logged the hour, and one of them, the harpooner, went down to the dead whale's severed flank still lying on the cutting stage and worked something loose from the wound in it and wrapped it in oilcloth and told no one what he meant to do with it. To understand what that was and where it went, we have to leave the deck of that ship and follow the paper. Now I'm composing the second part of the documentary, about 6,500 characters of narration that traces the physical evidence, the ship's log entries, the harpooner's account, the tooth extracted from the creature's remains and sent to the museum where it was catalogued, then mysteriously disappeared, and the pattern of bite marks across multiple whale carcasses, spanning decades that match the creature's predatory signature dot. The ship was the barque Aurelia, out of New Bedford by way of the Azores, Master William Croft, and her logbook survives, or a portion of it does, transcribed into a whaling registry now held in the manuscript collection of a New England maritime library. Entry dated the third week of a summer month in 1892. Latitude given in a cramped hand somewhere in the deep South Pacific, well below the 40th parallel, in that grey belt of water where the charts of the day carried more blank space than soundings. The entry is short. Whalemen were not paid to be poets, and Croft was not one. He records the taking of a large bull, the loss of the same bull to what he calls, in 4 words that I have read more times than I can count, a fish of great size, then a gap, then the position, the hour, and a single line beneath it that does not belong in a ledger of oil and barrels. God keep us from its like again. That is all the master would commit to paper. Masters were careful men. A logbook was a legal document, read by owners and insurers, and, if a ship came to grief, by courts. To write down a 100-foot animal that ate a whale off your hull was to write down your own ruin, to hand every underwriter in the harbour a reason to call you drunk or mad, or both. So Croft wrote 4 safe words and 1 unsafe prayer, and left the rest to the men. The men were not so careful, because the men had nothing to insure. The harpooner, the one who went to the flank and worked the thing loose in the oilcloth, was a Portuguese-born boat steerer whose name comes down to us, in the later museum correspondence, as Manuel Cordero, though the ship's articles spell it 3 different ways, and one clerk simply wrote the Portuguese. Cordero gave a statement. He gave it more than once, in fact, over the following 2 years, and the reason we can still read a version of it is that it was taken down not by a sailor, but by a man of some education who happened to be aboard, an assistant surgeon or a supercargo depending on which retelling you trust, and this man wrote it out in full and kept his copy. Read Cordero's testimony and the thing stops being a shadow and becomes an animal with a jaw. He describes the wound in the dead whale, not the wounds his own crew had made, the clean lance holes and the flensing cuts, but a separate wound, older, a bite that had taken a bite-shaped piece out of the living whale weeks or months before they ever found it, healed at the edges, scarred over, a great crescent gouge with the rim of it puckered and white. That is the detail I keep returning to. The whale they killed was already marked. The whale they killed had already met the thing that took it, had swum away from it once, carrying the shape of its jaws in its own flesh like a brand, and had been found and killed by men, and then found again by the animal that had bitten it before. And in the socket of that older wound, worked down into the blubber where the whale's own healing tissue had grown up around it and locked it in place, was a tooth, not a splinter, a tooth. Cordero describes it in the plain terms of a man who had handled a great deal of dead flesh in his life and was not easily impressed. Longer than his hand from heel to wrist, curved, the colour of old ivory going to horn, a cutting edge down one side that was not smooth like a whale's peg tooth but finely serrated, worked like the edge of a saw. He knew whale teeth. He had pulled thousands of them. He knew shark teeth. Every whaler did, from the scavengers that came to a carcass. This, he said, was neither. This was too large for the one and the wrong shape for the other, and it had been driven into a living whale with force enough to snap it off at the root and leave it buried. He wrapped it in oilcloth. And here the story leaves the sea and becomes a story about paper, about the slow indoor machinery by which a thing that is real gets turned into a thing that is filed, and then a thing that is doubted, and then a thing that is gone. Cordero did not keep the tooth. A man before the mast owned nothing and could keep nothing, and he seems to have understood that a curiosity of this kind belonged, if it belonged anywhere, in the hands of people who studied such things. When the Aurelia finally made port, first the whaling grounds resupply, then home the following season, the tooth passed, through the educated passenger who had taken the statement, to a natural history museum on the American East Coast. And the museum did what museums do. It catalogued the object. This is the crucial fact, and it is why I trust the bones of this account even where I cannot trust the flourishes. The tooth was accessioned. It was given a number. It appears in a specimen ledger. I have seen a photostat of the relevant page, under a provisional line describing it as the tooth of an unidentified large marine animal, South Pacific. Donor's name abbreviated, received in the mid-1890s, pending examination. Pending examination. Two words that, in the life of a museum, can mean a week or can mean forever. In this case, they meant forever. Because the examination never came, or if it came, it was never written up, and within a decade the specimen ledger carries a second annotation against that line, in a different hand and a paler ink. Not located, not destroyed, not discarded, not disproven, not located. The most quietly damning phrase in the whole archive, because it does not close the question, it just stops answering it. Somewhere between the accession and the annotation, the one physical object that could have settled everything, that a modern laboratory could section and scan and compare against every toothed animal that has ever swum, walked out of the record on its own two words and was never seen again. But the tooth was never the only evidence, and this is the part the skeptic has the hardest time with. Because once you know what the bite looks like, that crescent gouge, that puckered white rim, that particular radius of jaw, you start to find it in other places. You find it in the log of a Nantucket whaler 30 years earlier, complaining of bulls hauled up half-eaten before the crew could work them, blaming sharks, describing wounds no shark makes. You find it in a Norwegian whaling station's carcass records from decades after the Aurelia, photographs of flensed sperm whales with that same clean scalloped bite taken out of the peduncle, filed and forgotten under damage, cause unknown. Across 60 years and half an ocean, on animals that never met each other, the same jaw kept signing its name in the same flesh. And whales, I want to be careful here, because it matters. Whales that carried that mark, when whalers described them alive, were described the same way every time. Not sick, not sluggish. Running. Sounding early, breaching wrong, driving away from open water toward the boats as if the boats were the safer thing. The great predators of that ocean, the 60-foot bulls that feared nothing that breathed, had learned to be afraid of one shape in the dark, and they were teaching the men who hunted them, wound by wound, carcass by carcass, exactly what that shape could do. I'm composing the third section now, a long, immersive narrative passage in that same grave documentary voice, following the thread of vanished vessels, the survivors' vigil across 3 nights, a fishing town that abandoned its own name, and the slow revelation that whatever hunts them is methodical, patient, and fiercely territorial. So the question stops being what the tooth belonged to and becomes something colder. What does a thing like that do, year after year, in the same stretch of water, once it has learned that the boats are where the wounded whales go to die? Because that is the pattern that emerges when you stop reading the encounters as isolated horrors and lay them end to end on a chart. They cluster, they return. They happen in the same 40-mile band of deep water off the shelf edge, the same grounds the whalers worked precisely because the whales were there, and the thing that hunted the whales was there for the same reason we were. We were all fishing the same table, and something at that table had decided the men were part of the catch. Start with the vessels that simply did not come back. I am not talking about the ordinary arithmetic of the whaling trade, the ships lost to ice and storm and stove boats, and the plain drowning arithmetic of the sea, because that arithmetic is enormous and it explains almost everything. I set all of that aside. What is left, after you set it aside, is a small, stubborn residue of losses from that one band of water, in calm seasons, in fair weather, with experienced masters, that the insurers wrote off as founderings and the families wrote off as God's will, and that a modern eye reads differently only because of what came before and after them. The schooner Mercy Vane, out of a port I will not embarrass by naming, cleared the grounds in fine conditions and was never spoken to again. The barque that found her boats, 2 of her whaleboats, intact, undamaged, riding empty on a flat sea with the oars shipped and the lines coiled, as if the crews had simply stepped off them into the air. No fire, no blood on the thwarts, no storm within 3 days' sailing. Just 2 clean boats and a silence the log of the finding vessel describes in one flat line and then never mentions again. Men do not abandon good boats on a calm sea. Men are taken off them. And then there is the survivor, and I have read his account so many times I could recite it, and I still do not know what to do with it. He was the only man brought back from a boat crew of 6, picked up clinging to a stove hull after his vessel went down under him in the night, and for the rest of a long life ashore he told the same story to anyone who would sit still, and the story never changed, which is either the mark of the truth or the mark of a wound that never healed. He said that for 3 nights before the ship went down, they were watched, not chased, not attacked, watched. Something held station beneath them, matching their drift, and in the phosphorescence when the wake stirred the water you could see, he said, a pale shape lying in the dark below the keel, unhurried, keeping its distance, keeping its patience. The dogs aboard would not go below. The whales they raised in daylight would not stay raised, sounding the moment they scented what was under the boat. 3 nights of being followed by something that was in no hurry at all, and on the 3rd night it stopped following. That is all he could ever say about the end. It stopped following, and the ship was gone, and he was in the water among the wreckage, listening to men he had shipped with for 2 years go quiet, one after another, in the dark around him. He was not believed. He was written down, in the one contemporary notice I could find, as a man whose mind had gone in the water, which is the kindest way a century learns to say, "Be quiet." Because that is what the towns did with it. That is the detail that has stayed with me longest, longer than the tooth, longer than the empty boats, the way a whole working coast learned to stop saying the name. There was a name, in that fishing town, a plain, ugly local word for the thing on the grounds, the kind of word working men give to a danger they have to live alongside, and you can watch it disappear out of the record almost year by year. In the earliest depositions it is spoken plainly, matter-of-fact, the way you would name a reef or a current. A generation on it appears only in quotation, only when an old man is being reported, and always with that little distancing frame around it, the frame that says we do not believe this, but here is what he said. A generation after that, it is gone entirely, scrubbed out of the harbour talk, not by any authority, not by any order from above, but by the slow social pressure of a town that had buried too many men and decided that not naming the thing was easier than naming it. They did not stop believing in it. They stopped saying it. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole tragedy. A superstition you can laugh out of a town. This they carried in their mouths and refused to open them, and a fear you refuse to speak is a fear you have entirely conceded is real. And the shape of the fear tells you the shape of the thing. Put the pieces together, and it does not describe a monster, some blind, blundering leviathan smashing into hulls by accident. It describes a hunter with a method. Patient. It waited 3 nights. Deliberate. It took the men and left the boats. The exact inverse of a whale panicking in the harpoon. The exact inverse of any accident. Territorial. It stayed on its grounds, its 40 miles, its table, and did its work there and nowhere else. It learned that the ships herded the whales, that the wounded ones came off the flensing tackle trailing blood, that where the men worked the feeding was easy, and it learned the schedule the way any predator learns the migration of its prey. It did not fear the boats. It used them. The whales fled toward us because we were the lesser terror. The thing came toward us because we were the dinner bell. We thought we were the hunters on those grounds. We were the beaters. We were driving the game, night after night, straight to the one jaw in that whole black ocean that nothing living had ever taught to be afraid. And it was watching us do it from below, and it was in no hurry at all, because it had learned that if it simply kept station and kept patient, the sea would hand it everything it wanted, men and whales alike, in the end. So where is it now? That is the question you have been holding since the first shadow rose under that hull in 1892, and I owe you the honest answer, which is that there is nothing. No carcass has ever washed up, no bone has ever been dredged, no living specimen has ever crossed a net or a lens or a sounding line in a way that anyone could hold up and say, "Here, this is the thing, it was real, and this is what it was." A creature that terrorized a whole fishery, that a town carried in its mouth for a generation, that left its bite in blubber up and down the coast for decades, and it left the earth exactly as clean as if it had never been in it at all. That absence is the loudest fact in this entire case, and it is the fact the skeptic builds his house on, and I want to give him the floor because he has earned it, and because I have spent long enough with this material to know that the honest researcher hands his enemy the sharpest knife in the room and then asks whether it cuts. His case is good. It goes like this. The deep sea does not keep its dead the way the land does. A body that dies at depth does not surface bloated and photographed. It sinks, and it becomes what oceanographers call a whale fall, a feast that a scavenging ecosystem strips to clean bone in months and dissolves entirely in the cold acid dark within a few years. And the ocean floor is so vast and so unmapped that we have laid eyes on less of it than we have of the surface of Mars. So the absence of a carcass proves nothing. Of course, there is no body. There would be no body even if the thing were as common as cod. And the wounds on the whales, he says, those enormous raking gouges, those torn flanks, you do not need 100-foot phantom to make them. You need a very large shark, a big-toothed sleeper, a rogue outsized specimen of something we already know, taking bites from carcasses already dead and floating. Sharks scavenge whalefalls. They always have. The men on those decks were exhausted, half frozen, primed by their own trade to see the sea as a thing full of teeth, and in the dark and the blood and the terror they made one large real animal into a legend 100 feet long. And the vanished boats. The sea takes boats. It always has. It needs no monster to do it. I find this persuasive. I want you to hear me say that plainly, because I have no interest in selling you a sea-serpent. The whale fall argument is not a dodge, it is oceanography, and it is correct. The scavenging shark explains the scavenged carcasses. The cold explains the missing bodies. The exhaustion and the dark explain a great deal of what frightened men will swear they saw. If this were all we had, I would close the file and call it folklore and sleep well. But it is not all we have. There is the tooth. There is always the tooth. The one they pried from a carcass and mailed to a museum that gave it a catalogue number and then quietly lost it. And before it was lost, someone measured it and someone described it. And the description is the splinter I cannot pull out. Because the thing about the skeptic's shark is that we know our sharks. We know the tooth of every large predator that tears whales, living or extinct, and each one leaves a signature you can name: the serrations, the curve, the root, the enamel. The tooth from that carcass matched none of them. Not the great whites, not the sleepers, not the fossil forms the deep is supposed to have long since given up. It was the wrong shape to be a scavenger's tooth at all, not a slicing blade for stripping a body already dead, but something built to hold and to crush something that was still fighting. The one hard object this creature ever left behind was the one object that refuses to belong to anything we are allowed to believe in. And then it, too, was gone. Not destroyed, not disproven, just misfiled into the same silence that swallowed the log and the town's voice and the survivors' 3 sleepless nights. The record did not argue with the thing. It simply thinned around it until there was nothing left to hold. And that leaves the last question, the one the log never answered, the one I keep returning to at the bottom of every night I have spent inside this. We have spent all this time asking what it was and what it did and where the proof went. But run it forward. A predator that feared nothing, that the whales fled, that the men fed without knowing they were feeding it. That owned its 40 miles of black water so completely that it never had to hurry. What happens to a thing like that? Because it did stop. The bite marks that ran up and down that coast for decades, they end. The wounds stop appearing on the carcasses. The town's terror ages into an old man's story and then into nothing. Something that feared nothing simply, at some point, was no longer there. And I do not know what could have done that. Nothing in that sea was its equal. That is the whole of its legend. That is the shape carved into every scarred whale flank. So what killed the thing the killers feared? Did we, without ever knowing it, did the whaling that emptied the grounds of its prey starve the top of the chain quietly to death, so that the greatest hunter that ocean ever hid died not from a wound, but from an empty table, and we never even noticed we had done it? Or did it not die at all? Did it only do what it always did, the one thing it was better at than anything alive? Did it simply keep station and keep patient and go quiet and wait? In 40 miles of water we have still never truly looked at, for the dinner bell to ring again. Go back with me, one last time, to that deck in 1892. The shape rising under the hull. The eye the size of a porthole, open, unblinking, taking the measure of the small warm things moving on the surface above it. The scars on its back, where whales had tried to escape it and failed. The men who leaned over the rail and looked down into the water and understood, in one cold instant, that they were not the most dangerous thing in that ocean and never had been. They wrote it in the log. They stopped saying its name. They carried it in their mouths to their graves, and the water closed over the shape and gave nothing back, and has given nothing back since. If it feared nothing, what in the end was left to be afraid of it? And is the answer that something finally was? Or is the answer that nothing ever came, and it is down there still, keeping station, keeping patient, in no hurry at all?